Okay, we're going to get started now. I'd like to welcome you and thank you very much for joining the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. This is a series of events that have been taking place all semester long. The theme is Energy of the Future, Understanding AI's Potential for Sustainability. And this particular event is focused on sustainable mobility. So I'd like to, first of all, introduce myself. I am Christos Kassandros. I am a member of the Institute for Sustainable Mobility, ISC for short, and GridWise. And I am also the head of the Division of Systems Engineering and a professor of electrical and computer engineering at Boston University. The sponsors for these series of events are the ISC and GridWise, as well as the Hariri Institute for Computing at Boston University, and the student-run BU Energy and Sustainability Club. I know that many of you are familiar with the Institute for Sustainable Energy activities. However, I'd like to simply mention that a lot of the activities of the Institute on sustainable cities, on energy and water systems, and sustainable finance can be found at the easy-to-remember website, www.bu.edu/ISE. So the last thing that I want to do before we get going is to introduce briefly our three distinguished panelists, and then give you a very brief introduction to the theme that we're covering today, sustainable mobility and the role of AI in sustainable mobility. And then we'll get going with three relatively short presentations by our panelists, followed by questions and an open discussion. So we clearly welcome all of you as you listen to the presentations to contribute to the questions and answers part of the event by typing in any questions that you might have. We already have received a bunch of questions, so we are well prepared and well stocked in terms of the discussion, but we welcome more of these questions. So let me introduce, first of all, Pascal van Hentenryck, who is the Russell Chandler III Chair and Professor in the H. Milton Stewart School of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Georgia Tech. Pascal is the director of the NSF AI Institute for Advances in Optimization, so he is well versed in the central theme of today's event on AI. He is also the director of the Socially Aware Mobility Lab and the Risk Aware Market Clearing Lab. Our second panelist is Donna Chen, an assistant professor at the Department of Engineering Systems and Environment at the University of Virginia. And she is affiliated with the Cyber Physical Systems Research Link Lab and the Center for Transportation Studies. Donna's specialty is on how sustainable transportation systems are going to impact society, and in particular topics of like traveler safety, behavior, and the environment. And third, we have Nayeli Rodriguez, who is a program director at the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics here at the City of Boston. And she works and specializes in issues of equity and thoughtfulness around technology, public space, expanding the role of libraries in civic life, and planning for environmental health and justice in Boston's infrastructure. So with these brief introductions, I will now simply say a few things about the challenges and the topics that we will address with our three panelists in our discussion, and which are central to the issue of mobility and the role of AI. So briefly, when it comes to mobility, I see three components to moving forward. One is the new technology that is coming forward. And of course, this is central, and we're all familiar with it. Things like autonomous vehicles, electrification of vehicles, and so on. But then there's the aspect of the humans who are supposed to engage in this technology, adopt it, or adjust to how it should be used. And so this is an issue that I think we will have more to say later on in this event. And lastly, there are the effects of all these new technologies and the changes potentially in human behavior in adopting this technology on society. And there's always this hidden unintended consequences that come around with every new quantum leap in technological development. So I hope we will address some of these challenges, and in particular, the role of artificial intelligence, which is central in these technologies. So some of the challenges that we have to face have to do with the issue of choosing private versus public transportation. We will hear quite a bit about the role of public transportation and the role of shared mobility, the role of the so-called transport network companies, Uber, Lyft, and so on. Then there's electrification. This is changing our lives in mobility, but also in a broader sense. And clearly, the issue of electrification brings us closer to the issues of energy, which are central to the Institute for Sustainable Energy at Boston University. It links mobility to energy management because you have to interact with a smart grid to charge your car, and that entails a lot of complications. Then we have autonomous vehicles. This is something which I'm personally very interested in and work on. And there are sort of two extremes. There's the very, very rosy, optimistic picture of what autonomous vehicles will bring to our life. I'll mention briefly a very well-known statistic that 94% of all accidents are due to human error. So you can imagine, in the rosier of pictures, that if you replace human drivers by computers, which don't blink, don't sleep, don't drink, they love data, they process data very quickly, much faster than us, there is a possibility, at least on the safety part, that we can eliminate a large part of those accidents. We can also reduce congestion and do a lot for the environment, because much of the benefits of these autonomous vehicles will be to eliminate this start and stop that causes most of the energy consumption and emissions. But there's always the unintended consequences of bringing in these autonomous vehicles into the picture. This is sometimes referred to as the rebound effect. There's the issue of adoption. Why should people buy and adopt autonomous vehicles? And these are also topics that I hope we will address. And this also brings us to issues of equity and justice. Whenever new technologies, potentially very expensive, are introduced to society, this always becomes a very, very important issue. So there are economic factors that we also have to talk about. So this is exciting as well as kind of scary to some extent to think of all these complications that could come with the very well-meaning purpose of these new technologies related to mobility. So I hope that we will have a good discussion, and I'm ready to now introduce once again Pascal van Hentenryck, who is our first presenter. There will be brief presentations, about 10 minutes by each of our panelists. We may have one or two short questions specific to the topic that each panelist presents on, but the main part of the event will be in the last half hour or so, where we have questions and answers. So Pascal is an expert in public transportation and artificial intelligence, and the topic of his presentation today, and he may share his screen and be prepared to present at this point, it's the next generation public transit system, or as I see on the screen, on-demand multimodal transit system. So Pascal, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you, Christos. I'm delighted to be participating to this a very interesting session. When Christos contacted me, he told me that this was a session about transportation, energy, and AI, and obviously I work on the three things, but typically these are separated thrusts of research, and Christos is trying to integrate everything. And what I'm going to try to do in this brief talk is to try to see how these things can fit together in one particular context, which is these next generations of transit systems. So let me tell you a little bit about why mobility is so hard. So this is one of the things that this is one of the pictures that one of my colleagues in civil engineering, likes a lot, and it represents the fact that buses or rail are a much better use of infrastructure than cars, and therefore, people always ask, why don't we have more buses, public transit, transporting people across the nation, given that this addresses congestions and all other, all kinds of other issues. And the reason is this first and last mile problem. And if you actually make people walk more than a quarter of a mile, you essentially lose 90% of your ridership in a transit system. So you really have to pick up people very close to where they live, for people to use transit. But that requires buses to go to places where they are not really effective. And that creates this tension between the use of the transit system and its convenience and the way, it can, the number of people it can transport. The other things that you see also that is interesting is the greenhouse gas emission that are due to transportation. And these slides are a little bit old, but essentially today I think transportation is about 30% of greenhouse gas emission. And out of that, very small cars, passenger cars, and light trucks are responsible for about half of that. So it's a very significant part of environmental impact. And so what we have been trying to do is, can we do something about these issues? And these new on-demand transit systems are an answer to that particular problem. So what we are designing is a system which combines the best of public transit, in a sense, and systems like Uber and Lyft. So we have fixed routes for rail and buses, high-frequency bus, not like every 5-10 minutes. But then we have also these on-demand dynamic shuttles that would serve the first and the last mile. And the primary role is to connect people, to connect riders to the fixed routes such that they can benefit from the economy of scale and the minimizing congestion. But at the same time, they don't have this first and the last mile issue. So this is a simulation of a system like this for the city of Atlanta. And what you can see is that the blue things are the shuttles, and you see about 1,000 shuttles there. But the only thing that they do is actually servicing this first and last mile problem and bringing people to the rail. So you basically take a ride, then you take the rail, and then at some point another shuttle is waiting for you to bring you to your destination. So it's a fundamentally different way of organizing a transit system. And so the key assets here is that these transit systems are on demand, door to door. They address the first and last mile problem, but they're also multimodal such that they can address congestions and economy of scale. Now, they have a sustainable business model. We have shown for many cities that you can actually operate them for the same price as a transit system. In a city like Atlanta, it's $2.5. And they also plan and operate it holistically, and that's where AI is going to come about in a moment. To link this to electricity and electrification. So this is an ideal system for actually electrification, because there is no rental society for every one of the shuttles here. They are actually traveling only first and last mile. And over a particular day, for instance, they travel between 100 and 300 miles, which basically means that they can be charged about once every day. And you can do that during operation and potentially team that up with renewable energy. And so this is an ideal setting for really decreasing greenhouse gas emission. And obviously, one of the things that I like to emphasize about these systems is that they may have a big societal impact, because they give us the opportunity to go to things that are typically called transit desert. Martha is here in Atlanta, prefers to say underserved areas, but this is essentially giving access to areas which are not densely populated and don't have a very good access to transit right now. So when you try to see how that fits from a business standpoint and what it does to your system, so we did a lot of case studies with various transit system. The one in Atlanta is particularly complicated because this is a city with a lot of congestion, and also the public transit is only 10% compared to, let's say, 33% in Boston. And the time that it takes to commute by transit can be very long. It's 46 minutes in average, but it can go up to 90 minutes. And when you look at the design of the existing system compared to what we are proposing here, so what you would see is a very significant decreases in the number of buses. but a very large number of shuttles. You still fit inside the budget of the transit agency, Malta in this particular case, but you are able to almost decrease the transit time by a factor of 2 in average. So this is kind of what these systems allow you to do. It's a very different system from a convenience standpoint. Now, to do this, you have to plan and operate this system. So you have a planning side, which is all about network design, fleet sizing. And then you have an operations side where you have actually to schedule these shuttles such that they serve the riders as best as possible. They maximize ride sharing when they can, provided that it doesn't sacrifice quality of service. And behind the scene in every one of these aspects, you have AI technology. So this is an animation which shows you how this, the technology that we have for actually dispatching all the shuttles can be applied to a city like New York City. And the interesting thing is the way we do this is by having a model predictive control algorithm for relocating the vehicles at the right place, but also a optimization algorithm for dispatching and routing the vehicles. Both of which, the dispatch algorithm are based on AI technology. The relocation algorithm is a mixed, very large mixed integer program. And typically what you see is that in a city like New York City, you can reduce the number of vehicles from, let's say, 12,000 to about 2,000 and keep an average waiting time around 4 minutes, which is quite good. One of the things where AI is actually very interesting these days is that these model predictive controls have to run in real time, and they are very challenging computationally. So you can only run them for a number of periods in time. And so one of the opportunities here is to actually learn this model predictive control for a longer period of time. You learn them offline. And you optimize them offline, and then you learn that using a deep learning system. And what you can show is that when you do that, you preserve the quality of this model predictive control on a longer time horizon, which you cannot do in real time. But now you can you can use this machine learning model for actually relocating the vehicles optimally. Now, can we do better? One of the ways we can do even better is by using reinforcement learning. So even if, model predictive control algorithm is working for, let's say, an hour, you want to actually understand the longer term horizon. And so you can actually look at the trajectories in the simulation and use reinforcement learning to actually improve your policy, which is this, the model predictive control. And typically when you do that, you get about, 8 to 10% in improvement in the number of miles traveled by the vehicles. So let me mention another part where AI can be very useful, and this is all about the human behavior that Christos mentioned before. So a key worry of the transit agency is that what is going to happen if a lot more people are adopting the system? Are we designing the network properly? Are we sizing the fleet correctly? And that requires this kind of a game between the design of the system and then the way people are going to react. So you have to start modeling people behavior, understanding, doing machine learning model that actually capture what people are willing to do when they adopt the system, when they don't adopt the system. So let me just conclude by saying that this system is actually being piloted in Atlanta right now. So this is one of the shuttle which is running around. So you can think of this as Uber and Lyft type of application, but which are connected to this the operations of an on-demand multimodal transit system. So that's what I wanted to do. So this is also on areas in Atlanta which are really underserved and where you're trying to address this first and last mile issue. So that's what I wanted to tell you, and obviously I'll be very happy to answer any question.
Thank you very much, Pascal. I have one quick question as we get ready for our next presentation. So when we focus on this last mile problem, and sort of the previous miles are incurred by private cars, let's say. So they all converge to certain spots at which they need to presumably park to switch to public transportation or something. Does that create an additional new issue, which has to do with creating more parking and managing that?
So this is a good question that you're asking. And so one of the things that we had in the pilot here in Atlanta is that we have to actually find out where the various shuttles can idle. And they are typically in places where you don't have interference with traditional traffic. This was an issue that we spent a lot of time discussing because there is a trade-off in where you place those cars. And it's So the answer to your question is that we are taking care of that by choosing exactly where we locate them. They are not maybe the optimal places, but at least they don't interfere with traditional park and ride. And the other things that I can tell you as well is that when you look at congestion on this first and last mile, you don't really have that. So it's actually interesting. So we have We have studied that. Does it create more congestion? And it doesn't, in the sense, because they are really not in areas where you have you typically have a lot of congestion issues. So this is typically an underserved, part of the system, and people are not really, going to the transit system in those areas. So, but great question, absolutely.
All right. Thank you very much. So in the interest of time, we'll move forward and we may return to other interesting questions later on. So our next speaker is Donna Chen. And Donna, feel free to unmute and share your slides with us. So Donna is a specialist in the issues that have to do with the impact of all these new mobility technology, in particular autonomous vehicles, on transportation sustainability. So this is indeed the title of her presentation, and I'm turning it over to you, Donna. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christos. I'm very happy to be here this morning. I feel like that was a very good introduction by Pascal. And I'm now going to talk about sort of the flip side of this, which is about how people will adopt autonomous vehicle technology and what types of impacts that may have for sustainability. So when we think about how autonomous vehicles will impact sustainability, we primarily think about the two main forms these business models may take place. One of them is the shared autonomous vehicle, or the shared autonomous vehicle with pooling, a concept very similar to what Pascal just described, these little shuttles that go around, and people don't have to own these vehicles in order to access them. But of course, we also have private autonomous vehicles. We already have vehicles on the road today that have some self-driving, limited self-driving abilities, and it's not too difficult to see a future in which travelers will have access to privately owned autonomous vehicles. And of course, when it comes to this, the impacts are going to be very different. If we have a world where the majority of travelers use shared autonomous vehicles, especially with pooling, we can see a case where we have decreased vehicle ownership and potentially saved parking spaces. In fact, one of my collaborators did a simulation in Atlanta, Georgia, and saw that each shared autonomous vehicle can save something like 20 parking spaces, and of course, provide mobility options for the mobility underserved, such as those who don't have access to a driver's license, don't have access to a vehicle in public transit deserts. On the other hand, if we have a world where the majority of folks, own private autonomous vehicles, much like what is the case in North America today with human-driven vehicles, we may end up with a situation where we have even more vehicle miles traveled, because remember, these vehicles are able to cruise empty, right? So after the vehicle drops you off at your destination, maybe their parking fee is very high at your destination, and you're like, it would be cheaper to send my vehicle to drive a few more miles to park someplace cheaper, or just send it home. That could potentially worsen traffic congestion. We also find that people potentially value that time spent inside an autonomous vehicle as less aggravating as the driving experience, particularly when you're driving in congestion. So if that's the case, people may be able to tolerate longer travel times in a private autonomous vehicle, and that can exacerbate urban sprawl, which is already an issue. And of course, all of these things can contribute to producing even more greenhouse gas emissions. I want to refer back to one of the graphs on Pascal's introductory slide. I think transportation is actually now the #1 sector in GHG emissions. So it's even overtaking the electricity production sector. So when we look at this, it seems like how AVs will impact sustainability primarily depends on the mode choice that travelers make, whether they will choose these shared vehicles or whether they would prefer to have their own private autonomous vehicle. So when we look at the literature that looks at what factors influence AV mode choice, we can see that 3 groups of variables emerge as influential. The first set of these are the mode-specific attributes. These are things that can be optimized by all kinds of AI algorithms. Pascal's presentation just showed you, how can we decrease the travel cost? How can we decrease the travel time? How can we decrease the wait time, the walk distance, all of these things that travelers want. And these, in the previous literature, emerge as very consistent. Everybody wants a shorter trip with less wait time that's cheaper. However, when we look at the other groups of characteristics that influence mode choice, these emerge as more mixed, particularly these individual socioeconomic characteristics. So things like age, gender, driver licensure status, very mixed results in previous studies regarding how these variables influence how people prefer AV mode choice. And part of that is because some of these studies take into account attitudes, things like the trust in the autonomous vehicle technology, environmental conscientiousness, perception of autonomous vehicle convenience, whether someone enjoys driving, and then their existing perception of public transit. So some of these studies take that into account while others do not. But the issue is that there is correlation between those individual socioeconomic characteristics and the attitudes, right? Someone's age, gender, education may influence their attitudes as well as influence their mode choice. So when those attitudes are incorporated into the models directly into their utility functions, that can bias the parameter estimates for the individual socioeconomic characteristics. And so that is a limitation in the current literature. So what we wanted to do in our study was to explore travel mode choice by incorporating the attitudes as a latent variable that can affect that that can be affected by both by socioeconomic characteristics, but also influence mode choice. We also wanted to do our study in 2 different regions, because one of the shortcomings in the current literature is that the different studies focus on one region, they use different methodologies. It makes it very difficult to compare the results across different areas. So we wanted to implement the same survey instrument using the same methodology via a survey of 2 very distinct regions in North America. So in this case, we chose Seattle and Kansas City, and we chose these regions because they have very different population density. Seattle is denser. Seattle also has a higher public transit mode share, 11%, so perhaps a good second pilot city for Pascal's projects. Kansas City, on the other hand, is dominated by the private car mode share. Currently, 91% of trips in Kansas City are made by private car. Seattleites have a higher average commute time, higher median household income, and also has a larger percentage of population with a bachelor's degree or higher. And they also, unfortunately, have higher parking costs associated with living in that region. So the way we did this survey was we designed a survey with 5 different parts. For this survey, we asked the respondents to think about a reference trip. So this is the trip they currently take. We asked them to describe to us what the characteristics of the trip are, how long it is, how far it is, how long it takes typically, what is the congestion level, what mode they currently take. And then we introduced them to some educational materials about how autonomous vehicles may emerge in the future, especially in terms of the shared autonomous vehicle and a shared autonomous vehicle with pooling. Then we get to the meat of the experiment, the travel mode choice experiments, of which they take 6. And the travel mode choice experiments look like the picture here on the left, where we are giving them different mode-specific attributes, things like how long is the in-vehicle travel time, what is the wait time, walk distance, the travel cost, the fare, and the parking cost. And we give them the choice of 4 modes. Their current mode, whatever they currently choose, whether it's private car or public transit, we give them the choice of a private autonomous vehicle, a shared autonomous vehicle with no pooling, and a shared autonomous vehicle in which they ride with others. So for these choice experiments, they tell us what is their most preferred mode and their least preferred mode, and they take 6 of these experiments. Afterwards, we also collect sociodemographic data and then those attitudinal choices that I mentioned prior. So again, to avoid the bias parameter estimate issue I mentioned earlier, we chose to use the integrated choice and latent variable ICLV modeling approach here. This is, you can ignore most of the things on this graph. What's most important to note here is that in this model, the latent attitudes are really what's affecting or can be predicting the attitudinal indicators. These are the questions we ask them explicitly on the survey. Attitudes towards autonomous vehicles, willingness to share travel with strangers, attitudes toward trip location data privacy, enjoyment of driving, and environmental conscientiousness. But also the sociodemographics themselves here are allowed to both influence these latent attitudes as well as directly influence the utility function for the mode choice. So in this case, we allow that interaction between the latent attitudes and the sociodemographic variables to really try to tease out what are the effects of each. So now I'll share some results. So again, for those mode-specific attributes, we find to be very consistent with previous literature, right? The things like in-vehicle travel time, wait time, walk distance, trip costs are found to impact mode choices. People want less of all of those things. We also see that travelers from both regions tend to evaluate that in-vehicle travel time in the pooled SAV more negatively than in the shared autonomous vehicle. And that makes sense. I think most people, given the choice, would probably prefer to not share a ride with a stranger if all other things are equal. We did, however, see a difference in travelers' perception of the time spent in a private autonomous vehicle compared to a human-driven vehicle, that is HV in this bullet. So in Seattle, travelers are less sensitive to travel time in a private autonomous vehicle, 14% so less than in a human-driven vehicle. That means that given all other things remain the same, travelers in Seattle will be willing to spend up to 14% longer time in a private autonomous vehicle compared to driving their own vehicle. However, in Kansas City, we did not see such a relationship. In terms of attitudes, we also saw that for both regions, travelers show a higher probability of choosing that SAV pooled mode when they're more willing to share travel with strangers. Some people are just more open to these things, but we also found things that were region specific. For example, in Kansas City, travelers were less concerned about trip location data privacy, and therefore they're more likely to select the shared autonomous vehicle and pooled modes. In Seattle, we found that travelers who do not enjoy driving actually show greater preferences for the private autonomous vehicle mode. So we do see regional differences emerge. More specifically for individual socioeconomics, we saw that in Seattle, females tend to have a more negative attitude towards autonomous vehicles, and they're less willing to share travel with strangers. And this has been somewhat explored in previous literature. Females are typically more risk averse and more concerned about personal safety. We also see that in Seattle, seniors are more likely to report enjoy driving. In Kansas City, seniors are actually less willing to share rides with strangers, whereas females are less sensitive to trip location privacy concerns, while seniors are more so to be concerned. And then lastly, for the trip characteristics, we see that in both regions, trip purpose, self-rated trip congestion level, and trip distances influence mode choice. Specifically, those commute trips are typically associated with choosing private autonomous vehicles. We see a higher level of congestion on a trip is associated with choice of private autonomous vehicles, which is ironic because if everyone chooses their own private autonomous vehicle, we would have higher levels of congestion, which would then, I suppose, influence people to choose more private autonomous vehicles. So it's this never-ending cycle. And then lastly, we see that longer trip distances are also positively correlated with the choice of shared autonomous vehicles in the pooled mode. So actually in this study, what we find is that a lot of people defaulted to choosing the private autonomous vehicle mode as their preferred autonomous vehicle mode, probably because it translates most directly to their current mode choice, which is a human-driven vehicle. So the problem, though, is more of these private autonomous vehicles we have, the more problems we have. One thing I mentioned earlier was that private autonomous vehicles can relocate themselves after arriving at destinations. They may be able to cruise around for cheaper parking, or maybe they want to send themselves home so another household member can use this vehicle. So that can induce empty vehicle miles traveled and really change the demand of parking. So we also wanted to explore that in our study. So after the choice experiments about mode choice, respondents are also asked whether they would be willing to relocate their vehicle after arriving at the destination. So this is an example of what that looked like in the survey. So here we give them three choices. They can either park at the destination with a specified parking cost. This parking cost is based on the self-reported parking cost for this trip. And they also have the choice of sending the vehicle away for someplace else with a lower parking cost. And then lastly, not park, but send the vehicle to be used by other household members. So again, this is a best worst choice scenario. And then for this sub-experiment, we also found some regional differences. We found that in Seattle, females and seniors are far more likely to relocate private autonomous vehicles to household members. And this is actually opposite of females and seniors in Kansas City who did not have this likelihood to do so. We also found that in Kansas City, low-income travelers show greater preferences for relocating than wealthier respondents, but this income effect was not found in Seattle. We also found that in both regions, trips for medical, dental services, and social recreational purposes are associated with a lower probability of relocating the vehicle to household members. This is probably because these trip purposes tend to have more uncertainty in terms of the trip duration time. You know, oftentimes when you go to the doctor, you don't really know when your appointment is going to end. So that may introduce risk and uncertainty in terms of when they'll get that vehicle back. And then lastly, in both regions, respondents who reported saying that they actually considered the cost of relocation fuel or energy, those people are less likely to relocate their private autonomous vehicles than travelers who did not consider these costs. So in conclusion, through this choice experiment survey, we can see that latent attitudes are actually very important in explaining AV mode choice preferences. We see that these latent attitudes influence how people adopt the different modes, and there are linkages between the socioeconomic characteristics and those latent attitudes. So there's policy opportunity to encourage those more sustainable AV modes, such as the shared autonomous vehicle and the shared autonomous vehicle pooled modes, among specific groups who are more likely to adopt, because not everyone is willing to do so. And lastly, perhaps some public education campaigns to try to change the attitudes that currently hinder those SAV and SAV pool choices, such as personal safety, data privacy. Perhaps we can try to reassure folks of these things, and that would drive them to be more likely to adopt these more sustainable AV modes. We also see that travelers are much less sensitive to travel time inside an autonomous vehicle compared to a human-driven vehicle. So this is likely going to have induced vehicle miles traveled effects. However, we also see that local context really matters. We see that attitudes are different between the Seattle and Kansas City regions. We see that preferences are different between these two regions. So any policy instruments really need to consider local context. Something that, data that has been gotten from Atlanta cannot be translated directly to Boston, and we need to make sure that we do that thorough work before we implement policy. So some suggestions for policies to counter that induced VMT. One of them is to make that relocation fuel cost more explicit. We can educate travelers about this through the route guidance tool. So for example, Google Maps tells you if you relocate your vehicle, this is the associated energy cost. Some of those ride-hailing mode choice apps could also include this information, as well as other transportation apps. And then we should also consider explicit out-of-pocket costs, such as an occupancy-based vehicle miles traveled fee, because we really would like a future where we discourage that empty cruising effect of private autonomous vehicles. So lastly, I just want to acknowledge that this research was supported by the Jeffers Trust, along with my collaborators, Dr. Wenwen Zhang at Rutgers University, and our former PhD students who are now faculty members in China, Wenjin Zhang at Chang'an University, and Kaidi Wan at the Macau University of Science and Technology. And that is it from me.
Thank you very much, Donna. We'll switch to Nayeli. So Nayeli, feel free to unmute and share your slides. I have one quick question for you, Donna. So your two studies were done in Kansas City and Seattle, admittedly different regions, as you pointed out, and your observations also are you get different attitudes, but they're both urban areas. So I'm wondering, have there been studies, or have you looked at all in the rural areas of the US and the world, where we might get completely different attitudes or adoption mindsets in terms of AVs?
Yes, I agree with you. I think we would certainly see differences based on attitudes, but I think more importantly, one of the advantages of these shared autonomous vehicle systems is the efficiency that comes with higher densities. And in fact, if those simulations like the ones Pascal is doing, you can see that in terms of the operational efficiency, it is much more efficient in denser urban areas compared to rural areas. So I do think that in terms of a business case, the business case for those micro shuttles, shared autonomous vehicles, it's going to happen in urban and suburban places first before we get to rural areas.
Okay, thank you. All right, Nayeli, make sure to unmute, and I'll turn it over to you. I remind our audience that Nayeli will presumably give us a slightly different perspective since she is not working in academia, but she is a program director at the City of Boston's Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. So she will focus on some issues of the role of AI and sustainable mobility. Where do we go from here? So let's hear about that. Thank you, Nayeli.
Thank you. I can't start my video, so I'm assuming that means that I have some connectivity issues and the host disabled it for that reason, but maybe you'll be able to see me later. Yeah, so happy to be here. As Christos mentioned, oh, there we go. I'm going to have a slightly different take on these issues, mostly because I am coming at this from the perspective of the city. And, while we don't do a ton of our own research, we have the research of our experience with previous projects. So I'll talk a little about that. As the, topic of the day has sort of illustrated, the main space where Boston is currently working in, mobility and sustainable mobility and AI is around autonomous vehicles. So this is kind of the landscape that greets autonomous vehicles and autonomous vehicles researchers when they come to Boston. It's often referred to as a city of neighborhoods that are very diverse in their makeup and in their physical form. And just a couple key figures for you that are interested: about 685,000 inhabitants. That number is actually growing, pretty dense. Then a couple of things to also know about us in the AV and technology space. We love sitting in traffic, apparently. This is like a ranking of some of the worst traffic in the world, and Boston is, right in that top 10 list. We also have a very unique layout to our roads and our urban street grids. This is, what Boston looks like compared to some of the more, like predictable grid-like cities. Anybody who's driven in Boston probably can attest to the complexity of the landscape. We also, we have a very welcoming attitude towards people coming into the city. This was a headline that was part of an article when it was announced that self-driving cars were going to come to Boston. I think that's pretty emblematic of the, healthy skepticism that Bostonians bring to, outsiders coming to the city and trying to insert their new ideas. And we also love sports, obviously. This is, again, kind of just illustrating the attitude. And I think, like I say, a healthy and I would say for the most part, good-natured skepticism that we have about things like self-driving cars. Lyft and Autonomy choosing Boston to test its self-driving cars is like choosing to pay a pickup game against LeBron James. We've also got a lot of challenges in Boston. A lot of that stemming from the historic inequality that our residents have faced. So this is sort of a map or a visualization of people who earn more than 95% of the population versus people who have an average income of 20% of the population, or more than 20% of the population. And you can see that Boston, there's a high disparity there. So that's another kind of grounding truth that shapes a lot of our approaches. We also have a climate crisis. You can see here the last major nor'easter that flooded out a lot of neighborhoods because we are a coastal city and we are experiencing climate crisis along with the rest of the world in acute ways. That circled area there is actually a transit stop. So when it comes to sustainable mobility, like we got big challenges. We are working on a plan, to address that, which has a lot to do with going carbon neutral by 2050. So given all of this context, we have tried to dip our toe into the autonomous vehicle space. More than that, really. There was a 2016 executive order to allow AV testing on Boston streets. And the vision behind that was that we know it can help us address a lot of those challenges that I just went over. We were trying to move towards zero deaths, zero injuries, zero disparities, zero emissions, zero stress. That's what we really want. And we are hopeful, I think, with some healthy skepticism that AVs and artificial intelligence is going to be a part of that future. So, given that background, I'm going to talk through a couple of recent experiments and lessons learned that we have had from existing technology experiments, moving a little bit away from the AV space to talk about other smaller scale technology experiments that I think still illustrate where we're hoping to go and also where we've been around civic technology. So the first space that I'll talk about is around curb measurement. And, we obviously, like every other city, we're interested in understanding our curbs, understanding the demand for the curb space from everyone from parking to freight delivery to now, we're having more demand for things like sidewalk cafes or green infrastructure. Like everybody's demanding curb space. So we want to understand what the dynamics are there. Most of the time when we try to rely on technology to help us with that challenge, it looks kind of like that image that's on the left there, which is not our ideal scenario, both because it requires a lot of integration with our existing infrastructure, which is always a logistical challenge, but also because it can feel a little creepy. People look at that and they wonder what all that technology is and how it's really serving them. So this is sort of a story about how we went with this other technology, the one that looks more like the right, which is a super light touch solution, doesn't involve a camera. It uses computer vision to measure just simple volumes. And what we realized was that for a lot of the different questions that our urban planners have, they were relying on what the market was pushing to them, which was this like all-encompassing, video-based, algorithmic-based measurement system. But actually, that wasn't really what was needed in terms of the data that would answer their questions. The technology solution that was on the left was providing all of this data, everything from the video and asset tracking data that we were kind of looking for to like gang data, license plate recognition, crime data, all of these data offerings that were just built into the solution, but we weren't actually asking for. And it was contributing to this sense that, we were not right sizing our data collection to the question that was being asked. And as a result, we were kind of contributing to an increase of surveillance of our residents. On the right side, you have more what the Numina sensor was offering, which is just paths of movement and raw counts separated out by mode. So it could measure pedestrians, bikes, trucks, cars, and buses. And a lot of times that's actually the data that's needed. And it was a matter of just pointing people towards an alternative solution that actually worked better for our public works department too, because they don't like us to tap into all of their streetlights with a ton of hardware. They prefer a more light touch solution anyway. And so in addition, trying not to be creepy and surveil our residents and be able to create data sets that they would be able to use as well, because they didn't contain any personally identifiable information. We paired this approach, you can see the Numina on Tremont and Boylston last summer, with a signage approach that would actually let people understand a little bit about the technology that was there, alert them to the fact that there was a technology that they were walking by, and also give them a lot more details about the data set that was being collected and what it was going to be used for and how they could access it themselves for their own research, curiosity, or advocacy purposes. And, I think while we were in a way pushing people to use a dumber versus a smarter solution, it was a better fit for our needs. And when at the end of the day, we're trying to make these streets safer and also incorporate communities into how we make decisions about the streets, this was the data solution that was right sized to the question we were asking. And it helped us not be creepy, which we prefer. So waste management was another area where we experimented with a smart solution. This was the results. Everybody's probably seen these big belly bins around Boston. They have solar panels on the top. And when they were first rolled out in Boston, they came along with all of these data sets and a dashboard. The idea being that the solar panel was going to power this sensor system that would be able to tell us when the trash bins were ready to be picked up or ready to be emptied, and that was going to be able to let us reroute our public works crews all over the city, zooming around to respond in real time to this need. And anticipate behaviors in the future so that we could, schedule our routes for trash collection around that. And in fact, that's not how public works teams do their work. You can't have somebody zooming all the way from Roslindale to East Boston just because that's where there's another almost about to overflow trash can. That's not the way that labor is organized. That's not the way that is a healthy way for people to spend their lives, just dashing around. They need to have a relationship to their work and a relationship to the city as well. It's not predictable for workers, and it's not efficient, right? It's much better for us to have all the trash cans in a neighborhood picked up on a more regular basis, if that's what's needed, than to just be, crisscrossing back and forth across the city. It did not work out at all. It was a total failure. We don't use this technology anymore, although the bins are still there. Rather, I would have liked to see more thought about something that people actually wanted and needed, and actually can also reduce the problem of trash bins overflowing, which is a project that our team has recently rolled out, and that's incorporating community compost bins into more public space. So our team worked with the Public Works Department, the Zero Waste team, and also a couple community groups and public libraries to incorporate these community compost bins. They also worked with local artists to illustrate them, which is really great and is contributing to like more things than just the initial problem that was identified and actually enhancing the public realm versus just treating it as an issue that needs to be dealt with. And I thought this was a much better response to the issue of we have, a trash situation in different neighborhoods and we need a better way to manage our waste. This was something that people actually wanted and needed, and it is helping to address the issue. And it's also delightful and contributing to sustainability. So maintenance requests. Here's an area where we learned that it's really important to weigh expectation and reality when you're building new systems. So the 311 app was created a while back by our team and integrates this system of accountability where, a problem is reported, the problem is addressed by the public works team, and then they can kind of have a little bit of transparency and also sort of take a bow for the work that they do all across the city. When the app was made more user-friendly, it was actually overrun with requests. So in 2015, the app was created as a more user-friendly experience, and the skyrocketing requests led to a $500 million backlog, which on the one way we fixed something, but on the other hand, we created another challenge for ourselves. The other issue that we started to notice was that, on the first image here on the left, you can see where the highest frequency of requests was coming from, this sort of downtown Back Bay, Beacon Hill area. In the middle image, you can see where our actual sidewalk conditions are the poorest. So places where, regardless of the 311 calls coming in, we know we have issues. And then in terms of per capita income, that last image on the far right there is showing you, where we have the highest per capita income. So the relationship between these three images is that the requests were coming in at the highest frequency from the highest income neighborhoods, which tells you a little bit about their access to the technology and their trust of government, but it wasn't actually correlated closely to where we know that work requests are most urgently needed. So that led to a rethink of the 311 app, which now is looking to make the highest impact per dollar and increase the effectiveness that has a focus on people and needs, not just the squeakiest wheel that's getting the grease. We now also do full replacement instead of just partial repairs to the sidewalk and prioritizing where people are and where they're walking the most. And there's also now a social vulnerability index, which is helping us to better target where those requests are being filled and make sure that it's done in an equitable way. So the last experiment that I'll talk about is digital placemaking, which is an area where I have enormous skepticism. We get pitched all the time things like a digital sign or a new digital kiosk or a digital experience that you can deploy in your town squares, and it'll have a ton of content in it, and it'll be automatically assuming what people's interests are and being able to point them to the most dynamic idea that they could be exploring in the neighborhood. In reality, this is an example of one of those digital placemaking solutions that I visited just this week. They break. They require people to update their content, and they kind of take up space in the public realm that not everybody always is gonna know what to do with. So this was a case of, I feel like a lot of these solutions actually don't even hold a candle to just back to basics placemaking ideas. The past couple of years, we have worked with the Boston Public Library to extend their already free secure Wi-Fi outside of the buildings into neighborhood or into the surrounding areas. And instead of trying to create a device or hardware that can address their needs and interests, you just boost the Wi-Fi so people can access it for whatever that they need. And then also focus on creating just an active public realm. In this case, we were incorporating cooling misting tents to help people get out, beat the heat during heat emergencies as well. And it was providing a public service. It was creating a place people actually want to be. And I think that if you were, getting off the subway, looking for, a local yoga studio or whatever small business that these digital kiosks claim to be able to drum up business for, having accessible, free public Wi-Fi, reliable public institutions, and a vibrant public realm, I think can accomplish a lot of those same goals. So just to wrap up, I'll talk about some of the hopes that I have for where all of this is going, where civic technology could take us, and where AI hopefully will be conscious. So this is a quote from a civic technology provider that I will redact to preserve the anonymity of the guilty. So people say that, a lot of these companies say that they want to create solutions and build hardware that addresses cities' most pressing challenges, but this same exact provider was touting recently a data solution that was proposing to clear the air, gathered data about air quality that would help to reduce CO2 emissions, that was integrated into this traffic management solution that was going to reimagine the future of traffic. And I thought that really didn't hit the mark because we actually don't have an issue around knowing where air quality is bad in Boston. It's highly related to where the traffic is a lot of times. The challenge is around what we're actually going to do about it. And recently I had conversations with our Air Pollution Control Commission and the Chinatown Progressive Association that expressed they're actually not interested in having more data about the air quality in Chinatown, an area that we know has issues with idling, has issues with major infrastructure, and that contributes to a degraded air quality. They don't want more data. They want the city to do something about it. And until the city commits doing something about it, they actually don't want to be studied more. And I just find it really ironic that this technology company that's proposing to reimagine traffic is somehow putting out as an open question whether or not CO2 is related to traffic. I mean, the solution to reducing CO2 is just reducing traffic, not changing it somehow to be a better version of traffic. So I hope that we can solve better problems and reframe the problems that we're currently trying to solve. I have a little flag. Oh, sorry, I'm gonna go back to my previous problem because I really wanna talk about it. Right, okay, so hope number 2, I hope that we can preserve emotional intelligence. This image was making the rounds on Twitter recently, public transportation versus private transportation, and how cars, and buses and public transit may be presenting 2 alternate visions of the future, and maybe making the argument for why we should invest more in transit. And a certain CEO who actually has a lot of power about what the future of our public transportation will look like, expressed an opinion that I think is not really focusing on the emotional and creative intelligence that humans can bring to this problem, and just trying to focus on the quantitative measures of a transit experience, where in fact we need to really understand what people's emotional and creative capacity to solve these problems would be and incorporate that into what we do next. So I'm hoping that artificial intelligence doesn't become a move away from the value of emotional and creative intelligence. I'm not exactly sure what the answer is for how machines become emotional, but I'm sure some of the researchers here have some ideas about that. So third hope, I hope that we can unbake the biases that we already have baked into our system now. When Amazon Prime same-day delivery was rolled out in 2015, there were 3 zip codes that were not included in that. And they were not included because I think there was some assumption that same-day delivery was not possible in these 3 Roxbury neighborhoods because of either package theft or existing subscribers. But when you look at it, those are actually the neighborhoods that have some of the lowest household income in Boston. And this is a system that was designed by an algorithm to understand where demand would exist. But imagine if this same system was then, the rails on which a new ride-hail system based on existing taxing demand was created, or a mobile grocery store system that was trying to provide, groceries and could just cruise around the neighborhood based on where we thought people would be purchasing, would be made. It would be a flawed system from the start. And so I'm hoping that we can unbake a little bit of that bias from the existing digital systems that we've already created. What's more is that I think a lot of AV and currently ride-hail companies are talking about their solutions in terms of filling the gap in neighborhoods that have been underserved by public transit, which is the result of kind of long-standing systemic bias against certain neighborhoods that we're not invested in. But I don't necessarily think that that's unbaking the bias, because if we're just deploying these solutions based on previous mistakes, like we're not actually undoing those mistakes, we're just patching them over. So I'm really hoping that AI and technology will help us to address this in the future. And finally, I hope that we can measure success beyond efficiency. This was a project where the city was trying to understand its urban heat island effect, and where land surface temperatures were dangerously high for residents. The goal of this project ultimately was to create a system to notify residents and build community solutions to addressing heat emergencies. So kind of like call on your neighbor, check on your senior, the children and seniors that are in your neighborhood, and make sure that they're okay and raise awareness for what people can do to escape the heat. What they ended up doing was working with residents to collect a lot of data. It's sort of like a citizen science project. While this data, because it was the data set was created using these kind of low cost and like low fidelity data collection tools, it's not the level of data that we could use to make engineering decisions in our city, but it ultimately achieved the desired effect, which was to raise the profile of urban heat islands as a problem in Boston. So that was a success, even though it was maybe like not the most efficient way to collect that data. So I'll leave you with two thoughts and then wrap up. So I always am trying to think when dealing with technology questions that past behavior is a predictor of future behavior until it isn't. I, as you can probably tell from this presentation, have a lot of skepticism about the role of technology in improving our cities and especially improving sustainability and mobility solutions. I think that our past behavior has not been a very good indicator of what our potential could be for a more meaningful future. And if we do want to build something that we're more proud of as urban planners and urbanists, I don't think that we have any past behavior to look for a model other than that we have to break the model. And so, yeah, I would just want people to keep that in mind. And finally, just because we can find a way to sustain something doesn't make it sustainable. I think that we have to lead with our values, really examine what it is that we can already build, measure, or fortify, and make sure that those are the things that we actually want to fortify for the future as well. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward.
Thank you, Nayeli. Thank you very much. We're going to get to the last part of our event, which is questions and answers. And I have been monitoring the Q&A part, and I see a lot of questions that have been coming in, especially over Nayeli's presentation. Many of them are very Boston specific. Clearly, we have a lot of Boston people who are intrigued by some of the things that Nayeli said. So I have a lot of questions that have been coming in. I have a lot of questions from the audience that came in advance, and we have limited time. So I will bring up some of these questions. I am sorry in advance if I do not bring up one of your questions. I'll do my best to be as representative as possible and try to focus also on some of the issues that can take advantage of the expertise of our three panelists. I'll start just with a quick question of the 5 or 6, actually more, that came over the last 5 or 10 minutes, motivated by Nayeli. And Nayeli, this is a question for you. It's very specific to Boston, but I think it might be interesting. And the question is, what is the new mayor, Michelle Wu, doing to help the adoption of autonomous vehicles? And how so? If you have a question on that, please let us know, because it might be reflective of how the mayoral leadership at different urban places can help this.
So we haven't actually discussed, I don't think, changes to the existing EV policy with the current mayor, at least not that I'm aware of. I'll be totally honest, it's actually my colleague Chris in our team who manages more of the EV testing project. So we might have to get back to you on that because I'm not actually sure if she's been brought up to speed about what the existing landscape is. I do know that, as you all know from her campaign and recent efforts to free the T and make transit more accessible from a cost perspective, that transportation is very important to this mayor. And so I think that if AV companies and AV testing is going to move forward in Boston, it's going to be important going forward to frame it from the lens of how does this make transportation more accessible to people who don't currently have access or can't currently afford it. I do know that that's kind of the values that she's leading with in terms of specific changes to the existing testing policy. I think we'd have to get back to you on that because I'm just not personally as involved with that part of the business.
Okay, thank you. I may come back if we have time to some of the more Boston specific questions that have been coming in, but I want to go back to a question that may actually be addressed to me. In my introduction, I made the comment that 94% of all accidents involving vehicles are due to human error. And one of the questions that came in is that human error may actually be due to the way that we design streets. In other words, perhaps humans are not that responsible for those accidents, but it might be that it's poor street design. There's a point, that's a good point. There's something to be said about that, but I would like to just say that many of those accidents, first of all, occur in highways or in areas where people are just driving pretty fast and just trying to change lanes or are simply losing control of the vehicles and braking unexpectedly or accelerating too much. And number two, when it comes to urban areas where indeed street design might have an impact, this typically has to do with the design of traffic lights. In intersections, traffic lights play a role if they're not well designed, especially on left turns, which are the most difficult turns to execute and negotiate. That would be probably not the fault of the street design, but the traffic light design, so the controller of that intersection. So I just wanted to respond to that. Now, coming up to other questions. One of the sort of questions that may be addressed to everybody has to do with the role of data. I mean, if we're going to talk about artificial intelligence and its impact on mobility, that implies that we're using massive amounts of data, processing them. And the issues that come up are those of privacy of data. I think Nayeli mentioned that as one of the concerns. So I guess this is a question which is addressed to all of you. You can take it if you want. Donna, for example, you relied on a lot of data from individuals, and I'm sure that you were sensitive to this issue. So how can AI be used efficiently and productively and creatively without really interfering with the concerns of privacy and by extension also security? Donna, do you want to sort of, since you did some studies on that, maybe you can take a first crack at that?
Sure. I'm not sure that I have the solution to this, but I will say that in our surveys, people are consistently concerned about data privacy issues when it comes to using something other than a private vehicle. So I think in order to encourage those more sustainable modes of shared transportation, some kind of, I wouldn't say guarantee, but more assurance regarding data privacy is required before that adoption can become widespread. Now, I'm not sure what that solution would be. That is outside of my area of expertise. Perhaps one of my fellow panelists have some insight.
Pascal, do you want to take a crack at that? How do we handle data? Unmute.
Sorry. Even after 2 years of pandemic, we still have to unmute ourselves. I think there are a number of techniques that are actually useful in the context of privacy, which there is this entire area now of differential privacy, which is actually extremely interesting in releasing interesting data in a private fashion. Now, I don't mean by that it's always easy, but there has been a lot of research linked to mobility and how you can actually release data on mobility based on differential privacy. And that's one of the ways that I think it is possible to release very accurate, at least in an aggregate fashion, data, mobility data, for instance, using differential privacy. So that's what I would say. So this is also, an interesting area because you have to balance somewhat different criteria there, because once you use it, obviously you can create biases, and that has to be taken into account in the downstream processes. So you have to be aware of many things, especially if you use AI behind the scene afterwards in the downstream process. But they are technology, the technology to deal with these privacy issues.
Okay. I should also mention that if you want to privately answer any of the questions in the Q&A screen, feel free to. I see that Nayeli is already doing that. Let me switch to another question that I thought was interesting, and this I think was motivated by something that Donna, you said. You mentioned in your presentation that one of the potential uses or practical values of an autonomous vehicle is that after you reach your destination, you can have the autonomous vehicle move empty, perhaps go to a parking location or go home. And somebody said, okay, that sounds good, but doesn't that raise a lot of liability issues, legal issues? And this is a much broader question. A lot of the issues that may come up with the use of autonomous vehicles are of the legal variety. I don't know if any of us is an expert in answering that question, but since this was motivated by something you said, Donna, maybe you have some ideas on that.
Sure. So yeah, there's some uncertainty towards what kind of legal frameworks will allow any of this stuff to actually happen. So for example, depending on the state you're in, the legislation for autonomous vehicles, legal on the street autonomous vehicles is written differently. In some states, you are required to have a steering wheel that can be overtaken by a backup driver, but in other states that is not required. So that's kind of what's written in place right now. So you can see that already what we're assuming here with fully autonomous vehicles being able to cruise empty, we're looking at a future where states say you don't need a backup operator to this vehicle, right? Like they would be able to cruise empty, which is feasible based on the way some legislation is written in specific states right now. I believe, for example, Arizona is one of these states that does not require a backup driver, and I believe also Florida. But a lot of other states still are saying you've got to have that backup. So it's uncertain. It's also very different depending on where you are right now. So whether that is going to be more standardized as we move towards the future, I certainly hope so. We will see.
Yeah, I saw another question that came and it's very direct. Who is liable if there is an AV accident? And let me comment on that because this is a question that's not new. A bit of history. The history of autonomous vehicles and intelligence use of intelligence and higher control goes back, believe it or not, to the late 80s, early 90s. There was a big project in California called the PATH project. And the concept of platooning, that is grouping together vehicles, autonomous or not, so as to save spacing in between them and make it easier for people essentially to drive without driving, but just having a single leader of this platoon, say 10 to 12 vehicles, be responsible. And there were real experiments run in California highways, and they were very positive. The project was abandoned mostly because of this legal question. Who is going to be responsible? If there's a platoon of, let's say, 10 vehicles and there is an accident, who is responsible? Is it the leader? Is it the last car? Is it the car that actually causes the accident? And those issues remain. I don't know that there are any good answers yet, but with the advent of artificial intelligence and the proliferation, I would say, of software in controlling how your vehicle behaves, as opposed to the actual wheels and the axle and the real hardware, it may turn out that this problem will be, if at all, answered the same way that we answered the question, what happens if any of the software applications that we use today causes an accident or something bad to happen to you? So it's a very generic question, I think, not one limited just to the use of autonomous vehicles. I know that we're reaching the end of the event. There's maybe a minute or two. So I'll just have one more question, which was sent in, which is fairly general in nature. And I'm not sure who might be the best candidate to answer it. I suspect it might be Pascal. But the question is, what do you see as the key limitations to implementing AI in the mobility space? Are there any unique questions or scenarios that designers, programmers, and visionaries need to consider when integrating AI into an existing mobility system? So this is fairly broad. Pascal, you, I think, have worked with some of the most challenging systems that involve AI and mobility. Perhaps you can comment on that.
So I think there are things that are reasonably easy and things that are reasonably hard. I think the reasonably easy part is when you have a system operating, when you have the system has been operating for a long time. One of the things which is nice about mobility is that people are typically very very predictable and very loyal to the way they actually are traveling. So once you have a system operating, you will accumulate a lot of data. And this data is very, has a lot of interesting properties that you can exploit for actually improving the system. So that's the good news. The bad news is that most of us are trying to innovate. And when you innovate, you are deploying a system that nobody has used before. And that's much more challenging because you don't have the data. Most of the beautiful techniques that you have designed, using AI, machine learning optimization, don't apply because you don't have the data. So I think one of the things that we have been trying to do recently is to actually say, well, let's be more realistic when you deploy a new system and trying to learn, not with a massive amount of data, but with data that you see in real time, and try to adapt some of the techniques, to that. But that's a big challenge. The fact that when you deploy something new, you don't have the data. The other challenge that I would see is that, and I think Donna has talked about that, Nanieli has talked about that as well. We are dealing with people at the end of the day. And getting actually people to reveal their preferences is not always easy. And it's something where it's particularly difficult because it's very difficult for them to envision new systems. And so I think that's some of the challenges that we are facing right now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to bring the event to the end. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, the panelists, of course, but the audience as well. Great questions. As I said, I'm sorry that we could not get to all of these questions. I think we got to maybe just about 20% or so. Another round of thanks also to our sponsors, the Gridwise Alliance, and of course, the Institute for Sustainable Energy at Boston University, our BU partners, the Hariri Institute and the Energy and Sustainability Club. And I remind you that this is part of a series of webinars on understanding AI's potential for sustainability. Today the emphasis was on sustainable mobility. And on June 3rd, as you can see on your screens, there is the next one, which focuses on smart homes and energy justice. So with that, I'd like to again thank everybody, our panelists. Good to see you all. And I will bring this event to an end.
Thank you, Christos, for organizing this. This was a very nice event. Thank you.
Thank you. It was really great.